It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Let's say hello to foreign editor Christopher Dickey. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
All right. Pleased to welcome as well Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Where does one find World Politics Review?
The good place to look is worldpoliticsreview.com.
Okay. Mark Dean, journalist at Bloomberg News. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, François.
And Julia Wono, the head of the Africa desk at Internet Without Borders. How are you?
Great.
The World This Week, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag World This Week. See you in court. Donald Trump's tweet in capital letters caps a week of reversals over his travel ban on citizens from 7 Muslim-majority nations. The lower court magistrate branded a so-called judge by the president earlier in the week. It's even made his Supreme Court nominee uncomfortable, Neil Gorsuch, telling Connecticut Senator Dick Blumenthal that Trump's remarks were, quote, disheartening and demoralizing. The president reacting in kind.
You misrepresented his comments totally.
I asked you what your thoughts were, sir.
His comments were misrepresented, and what you should do is ask Senator Blumenthal about his Vietnam record that didn't exist after years of saying it did. So ask Senator Blumenthal about his Vietnam record. He misrepresented that just like he misrepresented Judge Gorsuch. Thank you all very much.
Christopher Dickey referenced the fact that Blumenthal served in the Marine Corps Reserve but didn't see actual combat in Vietnam.
Well, that's a hell of a lot more than Donald Trump did, isn't it? He spent the entire Vietnam era dodging the draft. He never did any time in national service. So I think for him to say that kind of thing is so typical. He strikes out at people whose weakness supposedly is in fact his own weakness. Why attack Blumenthal for that when we're in fact talking about judges and about respect for judges? But that's the way Donald Trump operates. It's one of the reasons that people have a little trouble following his reasoning.
And by the way, those remarks that his Supreme Court nominee, disheartening, demoralizing, they were confirmed by one of Neil Gorsuch's aides.
Of course they were confirmed. Whatever problems there may be with Neil Gorsuch, he's a good judge. He's a respectable man. He's got dignity, and he believes in the dignity of the office and of the courts, something that I think Trump is just completely unaware of or really doesn't care about.
So where does this...
Dignity is not really a word that fits well with Donald Trump.
All right, let's cut to the chase here. Where does this leave the relationship between the executive branch of government and the other 2 branches of government, the judicial and the lawmakers?
Well, in terms of the judiciary, it's obviously an attack on the independence of the judiciary. In the sense that any time the federal government appeals a federal court ruling, it's in essence criticizing the judge that made the decision. It's disagreeing with it, but it's always done in a very formal way, and it's never personalized. The judiciary is considered a branch. We know for a fact that certain circuits of the federal judiciary are more liberal and others more conservative. These are judges that are political appointees. Usually there's a sense of a sort of middle band that they operate in. But the circuit court that actually came down with the ruling that held up the stay on implementing the ban is known as a liberal circuit.
Okay,
so that much is still in the sort of acceptable discourse.
So this is
he goes over the line when he says so-called judge.
It's an unprecedented.
It's
unprecedented rhetoric. But is it changing democracy in the United States?
No, it's not. It's changing political discourse and it's changing the norms of political behavior. But the judiciary is still the judiciary. It still has all the force and all the power and authority that it's granted under the Constitution. And it showed that by essentially stating that one of the very reasons that it upheld the stay. Now, it's important to point out, they didn't throw out the ban. They upheld a stay on implementing the ban until it can be further argued in court. And one of the primary reasons they said that is because the federal attorney was claiming that in this particular instance the president's power was unreviewable, and the circuit court that upheld the stay made it very clear the president's power is reviewable by the courts, and I think that it was possibly beneficial for the rest of the country, but a strategic error for Trump to make that kind of maximalist claim in his first confrontation with the judiciary, because basically what he's saying is, I get to do whatever I want, and you guys get to sit there and keep your mouth shut. And I don't think any branch of government is going to respond terribly well to that, but certainly not the judiciary when judges are appointed for life and they have constitutional powers.
Julia Warner?
Yes, I quite agree, and would even say that this presidency will probably ultimately be a challenge for the checks and balances procedures that exist right now in the U.S. institutions. But to be fair, try to be fair to the President Trump. He's never been into politics. He hasn't studied law. He's not familiar with being with the rules, basically. I mean, he's been criticized for not respecting tax rules, for instance. So it's probably a lesson that he's learning as well, the same as Angela Merkel told him that there were international conventions that you cannot violate on the issue of refugees. So he's probably also learning that in the U.S. you cannot.
But Julie, he spent a lot of time in court. He sues everybody at the drop of a hat. He's
Yes,
Mr.
but-
Litigation.
but
you can't say he
he
doesn't know
also-
about courts. He knows all about litigation.
He knows about litigations, but we also have to remember that he also knows a lot about solving litigation issues with money. He did that prior to being sworn in a few months ago. So apparently he's never really been confronted with judges who, no matter who you are, no matter how much money you have on your bank account, you are bound by the law, like any other. You're the president, so you're bound by the Constitution. But I think it's a lesson for him as
Donald
well.
Trump is getting a civics lesson here is the optimistic view, possibly. But the judiciary is still the judiciary. American law will be upheld, but the institutions are taking a hit here, and I think we're very far down a path that is not one blazed by Donald Trump, but which he's pushing further, which is the attack on the checks and balances, on the institutions as they were set up by the founding fathers. And this dates back 25 years now, anti-politics, politics. The institutions, the laws are there to prevent everything, to protect people from everything becoming political and everything just becoming an argumentative free-for-all that Donald Trump wants it to be.
Because we're very shocked on this side of the Atlantic that when we see that you elect judges, for instance, in the United States. So for people on this side of the Atlantic,
every country has its way of doing things, and whether the judges are elected or appointed, there's advantages and disadvantages. That's not the question. It's that in the major developed democracies, the institutions and the constitutions are designed, and the traditions, by the way, are designed in a way to protect people from the tyranny of the majority and the sheer rough and tumble of politics. And the concern in this here is that Donald Trump is degrading an important institution that deserves public respect.
It's not a personal power. I mean, it's a country with a constitution and with different powers. Saying this is admitting that finally the U.S. Constitution is a bit fragile. Finally,
But it is in the sense that I think to begin with, I think it's important to not always reflexively condemn Donald Trump. I think it's important to give him the benefit of the doubt, and at the same time, I think it's a little optimistic to think that he's learning things or that he's internalizing these lessons. I think that what you said is really important in the sense of practices and norms, because there is the Constitution, it is very strong, and the institutional checks and balances. But for instance, if Congress rolls over and doesn't impeach the president for impeachable offenses, then the Constitution doesn't mean anything. It's important to remember, for instance, Richard Nixon, there was a constant drip of his infractions. It wasn't until it came out that he had actually recorded all of his criminal conspiracies in the White House that finally the Congress moved to impeach him. So there is a huge amount that's based on practice and that's based on the conscience of individual lawmakers and whether they decide to stand up, and judges.
Stating the obvious, a president wields a lot of power.
Well, he does, but what Donald Trump is doing, and it's incredible that he's done so much of this in less than a month, is essentially degrading the legitimacy of the American government and its institutions. To call a judge a so-called judge, that's fine if he's talking about a lawsuit in some New York court that he's dealing with, but these are major issues, major constitutional issues. So-called judge. It's not a very big jump from that to calling him the so-called ruler of the United States. Or as
which is what he's petrified of.
Scrotus, which I think is a particularly
which is what he's
good phrase.
petrified of, which is why he constantly talks about his overwhelming mandate. But I have one thing I'd like to say. Why do you say he's a really powerful president? He's got record low popularity numbers. He won by 100,000 votes in 3 counties. I feel like in a lot of ways,
the office of
the presidency is
wields a lot of power.
But he, I think,
and he's demeaning the office.
And he's
every
demeaning
day.
the office. But I think he's very close to becoming a paper tiger, and people will see it the minute he has a confrontation and he can't back it up.
Martine, a question. Next week, we have Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, in Washington today. They're going to play some golf over the weekend. We were wondering earlier whether or not it's a good idea for the Japanese Prime Minister to let Trump win or not at that game of golf, but maybe we'll talk about that another time. But I want to ask you, among those who are going to the White House next week, before Benjamin Netanyahu, is Canada's Prime Minister. How should Justin Trudeau play it?
Very difficult. This is Canada is coming very far down the list. The world forgets that, Canada is a mouse sleeping or sitting next to an elephant, and there's a very long and open border. Canada has been spared some of the wrath of Trump because even Donald Trump realizes that tearing up, for example, the free trade agreement with Canada itself is damaging to U.S. interests. It's very difficult. There's no easy way. A Canadian prime minister cannot enter into direct conflict with an American president. At the same time, I don't think that it's...
and they're so different.
They're very different president. Well,
yes.
I mean,
we could talk about that all night. They like tweeting, both of them. So,
but not in capital letters.
We saw the kind of dilemma that it puts leaders in with Theresa May, where she thought she was going to actually win some political capital by having a successful trip and visit with Trump, and she gets home, and all of a sudden there's this controversy over him getting a state visit to Great Britain. So,
if I could just say, there's always sort of a little bonus for Canadian leaders in sort of sticking it to the Americans, just sort of stoking the little anti-Americanism that exists in Canada, and so, but it's there's a very delicate tactic to play for Justin Trudeau.
all right, so
There'll be a wrath in return.
We'll watch that little phrase when it comes. The press in France getting the hair dryer treatment on Monday from one of the leading candidates for president, conservative François Fillon, apologizing for misreading how times have changed when his wife and 2 of his children were put on his payroll for years. He insists that even though Penelope Fillon never even had a professional email address, she really did actual work. He also accused journalists that were stirred up by the left of conducting an unprecedented political witch hunt. What did you think, Christopher Yaki, of the rhetoric he employed in that Monday press conference?
Well, he's either going to hang tough or he's not. And he decided to hang tough. What's he going to do? He can say, I didn't. Yeah, he's just going to hang if he falters too long. I mean, remember that when he gave that press conference, his own party, a lot of people were leaking and saying, maybe we should find Plan B. Let's find somebody else. And the whole message of that press conference was, there is no Plan B. I'm Plan A, B, C, and D. That's the only way he can possibly survive, and it may work. We're still almost 3 months away from the final election, so it may work for him.
Have times changed, Julia Wano, or can he hang on?
He will. I mean, he has to hang on as a candidate, like he says, who has been elected by...
Unless he's formally charged.
Unless he's formally charged. And despite him criticizing the financial prosecutor, saying that...
This is the interesting point, because he's calls for the investigation, and now he's turning against his lawyer, turning against the judges, saying that they're biased, that they shouldn't be the ones... He's changed tack on this. attacking the press, attacking the magistrates. Does that remind you of the previous conversation?
Yes, it does. And well, all this is reminding us of even the previous election. With, for instance, the fact that Macron has been. I mean, there's been news on Macron's personal lives. So all this. There are parallels to be made between how the campaign was happened in the United States and how it will happen in France, and it's happening at the moment. But back on this prosecutor independence issue, because that's what the Fillon lawyers of François Fillon are reproaching. Well, claims of independence of the prosecutor in France have always been. I mean, they're quite. The country is quite used to that. But the difference with the financial prosecutor is that it was created in 2013 because under Hollande presidency, because of Jérôme Cahuzac affair. So the name of the former
the budget minister was caught for tax evasion. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so it's a particular case. We're gonna have to take a quick break. We'll pick up on this, Julie, when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week.